Yvonne, a natural question that everybody asks, even if only in their head, when they meet an artist is, well, how did that happen? How did you become an artist? And of course, well, how did you become an artist?
Well, mine is a rather remarkable story because I was born very shortly after the war, and I was born to a father who was interested in abstraction. He studied in Berlin, and so when I actually grew up, from the very moment, I was surrounded by paintings and conversations that he had with his friends, and their inquisitiveness about existential matters, Nietzsche, the nature of consciousness as it was possible in those days, the nature of universality, particularly, and spirituality. So those kind of subjects were frequent part of visits and conversations, and of course I was fascinated by the importance that they gave to art, and how they discussed and described to each other what they were looking at. So I was fascinated from the word go, and just never even imagined I would be anything else.
What can an artist do, or what does an artist do? Particularly in the milieu that obviously pertained after the Second World War in Germany. I guess my simple question then would be, what does an artist do, or what can an artist do in light of the complexities and I suppose you could even say, the horrors that exist in the world?
Well, yes. From a very early age, I was made aware, because not only was I born there, but I was also brought up just a few kilometers away from one of the most notorious camps. So the horror of what human beings could do to other human beings, including children, was beyond my ability to grasp, but at the same time, it just left this huge gap of questions. Like, who are these people? Who are they? And even to this day, I can't stop shaking my head. It just every time I think about it, my head just is in denial. It's like, really, this is happening? So that's one part of growing up and being absolutely devastated and made from the very beginning extremely suspicious and curious about these weird beings I was surrounded with. The second thing is that I was extremely optimistic, and I think I was I was a creative child, so being brought up in that milieu, I always had ideas and I wanted to make stuff, and we even dug a hole trying to get to China, because we were told China's on the other side of the world here. And we had all sorts of adventures as kids, and so there was this weird combination between optimism and total devastation about the human race. So what can an artist do? Well, I think number one, be a witness to your own time. Of course, I couldn't have said that when I was 6 or 7, but in time, I think that's, to me, what I've learned from art, is that the artists are a witness to their own time, and we can share that with them. But also, I think that, and here I can only speak for myself, I was very curious about human nature, and I really needed to understand how that operated. And I think coming through this whole methodology of abstraction, which was really form and color, trying to have this kind of a conversation was not difficult for me, since I had complete faith in the fact that the visual language was capable of speaking about everything. So yeah, I just proceeded to try and articulate through the visual language, as opposed to music or other forms or writing, and really discover who are we, how do we know the world, and what are the paradoxes that we encounter as we try to exist with both that innate reality that we're given by nature in order to survive, and this notion of reason and desire that we evolve with culturally. So yeah, that's been basically the kind of framework of my work.
The core of your practice, you might say. I'd like to actually just read a short quote that I'm interested in, and I'd like you to explore it if you would. The quote is, "I'm interested in painting for its projective properties, which is to say, I'm interested in projection rather than painting. I look for acts of projection wherever I can find them, and work accordingly to discover their performative potential." It strikes me that in that statement there's a number of codes or hidden thoughts, you might say. Maybe they're not so hidden. Could you explore that quote at all for me in light of this question of what would constitute the core of your practice?
What has always interested me is this concept that energy is space in motion, and space, in fact, is energy at rest. And when you start to contemplate on those two concepts, one's relationship to those experiences shifts and in effect becomes a little more palpable. I had, in the early 70s, I had an opportunity to understand that perception, human perception, is fallible. In my research on belief, I found it helpful to understand that when you have a perception in itself cannot become a concept. For example, you might have a perception of red, but it actually doesn't become the concept of red, which is different from the concept of green, unless it goes through a set of beliefs. And we have both belief structures and belief systems. So whatever your perception in the world, all your perceptions in the world must go through a set of beliefs or belief systems. Yeah, and suddenly one understands that one's motivation is always subject to the set of beliefs that we actually develop throughout our life. And sometimes those change in the way we understand the world. The idea of painting as a surface that you can create an illusory perception of space, and at the same time you navigate the physical real space, those kind of projections collapsing into each other were fascinating for me, because one of those projections would be the notion of belief. And so painting to me was no longer just painting as a surface, but it had in my encounter with the world, it became just that kind of aperture between this reality, which is physical and material, and the other reality which is ephemeral and immaterial. And to me, being especially alive in this moment where virtual realities are beginning to abound, I thought that was, in a way, a good place to be, a good place to observe what was happening and how I understood that.
We have in the studio at the moment, of course, it's a studio, so we have a number of works, and I wonder if you would talk to one or other of those works in light of these questions.
Well, yes. These works are in progress, actually. They're not completed yet, but I've just recently come out of a period of working more three-dimensionally, working with constructions in space, and I've wanted to go back to paintings that I did in the 90s, late 90s, well, early to late 90s, which were really about making an equivalent, a visual equivalent to the way that I experience the world. In other words, there's a simultaneity of events that occurs and information that abounds around us that is, I try to find a structural equivalent to that in these paintings. So having already moved outside of the painting, I decided to work with points outside of the painting and works with points inside the painting and create a kind of configuration, pictorial configuration that gives the appearance of simultaneous shifts, spatial shifts. But also at the same time, through these paintings, I'm also interested in finding shapes that are integral to the structure itself. So I've made studies of the very structure and come up with these kind of shapes which are three-dimensionally attached to the surface. So this is one aspect of it, but these shapes are not fixed within that surface. In fact, they're trying to somehow escape beyond that surface. So here is the painting, something coming out of that painting and moving into another spatial presence. However, at the same time right now, I'm also interested in not just going out, but going in. So in this painting, I don't know if you can see it, by framing an aspect of that painting, we have this other illusion of dropping into the painting. So I'm not, the conversation is ongoing, and so I'm not really ready to kind of pronounce on it, but if you're asking me what's going on here, well, a little bit of that. Because I've made a whole series of works in which are projective in the sense that you have to project yourself into the reading of those three-dimensional objects in order to read them. And that would be words. I did a work called Melancholia, in which I wrote all the words in 3 dimensions, but I laid all the letters on the side, and the surface of the work has little windows, which are the ends of all of the letters, and as you look through those letters, you're seeing the interior of each of those letters, and you decipher it in a very different way from reading a letter in space. So, it's projecting yourself into that reading.
Yvonne, the question of art and ideas is one of those fascinating discussions that quite frequently does not actually bring in the question of materiality of art. But art is material, in whatever form of material that might take. In your own case, how do you see the relationship between ideas and the materialization of those ideas?
When I first started out making these black and white works, they were initiated by this question of how do we mark our presence in that sense of continuity. And I was working off a grid. As I was imposing a center on the sense of continuity to mark this notion of presence, I realized, of course, nothing happens. So then I extended that center through axial extensions, which were really my body, this notion of the center, then the arm, legs, and it became the axis. And I was moving this axis. So sooner or later, as I moved them gradually, this interesting phenomena of a fold occurred. But talking about the material, well, how do you mark these moments of material presence? And traditionally we paint with a brush or glaze or roll, as in the 60s, did a lot of rolling with little rollers to create smooth surfaces. And but for me, there was a sense of materiality that was no longer really associated with the tradition of painting. What I basically thought of in order to mark these moments, these incidents, is I wanted just to take the pot of paint and I wanted to deposit in that area a material. So I took the paint and I just wiped it off like that, so that really what you have is not, a kind of trying to get a smooth surface, but you have a material presence there. So for me, that was, it took a while to understand how I could mark that presence of the materiality as a notation rather than as a painterly gesture.
When we use the word abstraction, you talk about growing up in an art world that was largely given over to abstraction. It's too easy, I think, for us to assume that abstraction is immaterial, that it is an abstraction from the material world. And yet, I hear you talking about actually seeing the act of painting, the act of making the work, as a very material one, despite the fact that, I guess to the casual eye at any rate, these works would seem highly abstracted.
Well, number one, it was never a doubt in my mind that a visual language was, in that sense, abstract. Because we respond, whether we acknowledge it or not, we respond to color, we respond to shape, we respond to location, we respond to the relationships between shapes and color and material in a way that we take for granted. We listen to music, nobody asks if the musical note has a kind of reality about it. It resonates, and the series of musical notes resonate and are evocative of our emotional responses. And so with painting, for example, we have not just a resonance that is visual, but we also have a material resonance. So the materiality of the painting resonates, whether it's painted in an incredibly ephemeral, highly, almost non-existent surface, as they did with layers of glazes in the Renaissance, or you have Mondrian painting his paintings extremely rigorously, touch by touch, trying to make an even surface at the same time leaving that mark of touch. So for me, the idea that abstraction, it's a kind of almost an unfortunate word, it's not really abstract. It's actually incredibly present. So for me, I was lucky enough to grow up in a sense that I just never even occurred to me that I couldn't say anything I wanted to say with something that was non-figurative. In fact, I can say things that you can't say with figuration. I can talk about ideas that you, in a different way than if I were to only use figurative or representational elements. So I was, of course, that is one of the problems in terms of being in a world where most people depend on representational information and haven't really had the opportunity, I think, or the belief that I grew up with, that I can say whatever I want to say with non-representational representations.
Literature, or reading in general. How important is reading to you, given the strong relationship that you have to visual language? What relationship do you see between literature or reading, writing for that matter, and you do write, and your practice as a visual artist?
Words. Yes, I write, but words are not my first... I wasn't really any good in German. I was absolutely useless in French. And I'm a little bit better in English, but words don't flow off my lips, or they don't flow the way that people can use words so easily, some people. So I really admire writers that have that incredible capacity to represent to me through words complex and fascinating, interesting worlds. And one writer that stands out was Georges Louis Borges, and I don't know, something about South American writing, sort of strange, imaginary, philosophical, existential realities. And the story Aleph made a real impact on me. In fact, one of my studios, I had a whole phrase, several phrases of it written on my wall, just because I just loved to hear that phrase repeated over and over again in my head. And actually, interestingly enough, Shakespeare, when I first learned English at the age of 15, and Shakespeare was just like, I could memorize Shakespeare. There was something about the rhythm. But the Aleph was particularly significant because of the narrative of the story. It was the protagonist was invited by the brother of his lover, invited him to have lunch at his home. And the only reason he went to have lunch and liked going there is because there was a painting of his lover. She had died at an unexpectedly early age, and so he would go and sit there and just look at her image. But this particular time, the brother was saying to him, well, I've had this really interesting experience, if you go down into the basement and you lie on the floor and you look up 3-4 steps up, and then between that and the pillar, there's something that you should see. So the protagonist goes down into the basement and follows the instructions, and what he sees is this aleph, this simultaneity of seeing everything at the same time in the world, every image that had ever occurred. But amongst those images were also images of his lover. And he was, of course, ecstatic and delighted to see it, but suddenly also realized he saw aspects of her that he didn't want to know about. And just that whole image just somehow resonated with me. And so I called a whole series of works Aleph, etc., etc. But it was only recently, actually, that I know, it's amazing, our minds. It was recently that it hit that the Aleph was the perfect story for having grown up where I grew up, and I loved walking I grew up in the country, so I loved just looking at things and lying in the grass and listening to the insects and having this incredibly romantic relationship with nature. But at the same time, having been exposed to human nature, something I would have never wanted to know about. So, the Aleph became like the perfect representation of that experience.
So I'm going to pose the question, does the absurd or the comedic resonate with you either in your practice or in the way you come to your practice?
Sometimes it feels amazingly strange to be doing what I'm doing for many, many different reasons. The lack of interest in it, of course, but wow, I gain a lot. But really, here we are, expanding into the universe through our own sort of limited sense of consciousness, as much as we possibly can. But here we are, so miniature and insignificant in scale, yet so necessarily important that, to me, the absurdity of it is just, it exists. And so as much conviction and intention and playfulness as I bring to all of this, and playfulness is a big part of, I think, who I've always been. I love playing, inventing and shifting and changing, and give me something that is like that, and I'm not happy until it's like that. It's just somehow wanting to to organize something, but change it dramatically in some way, to somehow, through the experience, see it or know it. So, I think absurdity, if you don't understand that reality, then it keeps me extremely humble.
There's the practice of art, and there's the history of art. And the relationship between practice and history is one of those, fundamental realities of any professional artist's understanding of their practice and the context in which they work. To what extent with art history, and of course I have to mention here that you do have a PhD in art history, but that's another story, I know. To what extent does history seem to be an important aspect of your own practice?
One particular event, actually I should mention that really changed my whole relationship to history. When I was living in England in the 70s, and I had an opportunity to work with Richard Gregory on the Cafe Wall illusion. That's another story, but during that time, he invited a group of scientists, cognitive scientists, and some individuals whose specialty were vision, to the lab. But as a little treat, he also invited them to come and visit the Camera Obscura Observatory, which was in the Clifton Downs, not far from the lab. And so we all went, and the Camera Obscura Observatory was used in its infancy for celestial observation. It was a tower, and at the top of the tower there was a room with a concave, very large concave table that could go up and down, and there was a mirror lens configuration that could turn. And so in this particular instance, instead of celestial observations, it had been used mainly to observe the downs. So you have this, it's like in this particular instance, photo camera and seeing the plate at the back with the projection. But now it was like looking down and seeing the downs, and people with their dogs running, and the wind blowing trees, etc. on this big table, concave table, which was concave according to the lens so that it would be focused. So we all entered into this room. I think there were 6 or 7 of us, and this was considered this kind of observation was very popular in the 19th century, pre-photographic. And so we all walked in there, and one of the persons exclaimed with great surprise, "Oh my God, it's in color!" Like, we all looked at each other, kind of, so he was shocked that he actually said this. But in that very moment, I put 2 and 2 together, and I said, this guy came up here thinking it's a 19th century pre-photographic event or early photography, and he's expecting to see things in black and white. And he's surprised it's in color. And it just had this incredible effect on me that I realized that, we have beliefs about the world, and that modify our expectations, or give us even more so, beliefs seem to give us permission to make certain gestures in the world. And as an artist, I've always sort of understood that I give myself permission to make certain gestures. But I hadn't really connected that to beliefs. And that was a moment for me that was amazing. Just like, wow, yes, that was an understanding that became my doctoral thesis, which, because I was curious, not because I wanted to have a PhD in art history, but I just really wanted to see what were the beliefs at different cultural moments that gave artists permission to make certain kinds of gestures. Because in terms of painting, well, of course, there are many different kind of pictorial representations, and it was fascinating. And so it was, out of that experience came the desire to really make some research. And I loved every moment of the research, although I really would never call myself an art historian. I mean, I did my research, I wrote my huge thesis, but yeah, anyways, I'm an artist.
Do you think that there is a zeitgeist? Is that an old-fashioned term? Do we have any single zeitgeist now? Is there a zeitgeist or some sense of the now that you feel resonates with your own practice?
Zeitgeist, I've heard it all my life. So zeitgeist had this sense of totality. And I would say that while everything is, and I've lived in 4 different cultures, including the Middle East, and I've always found everything is more local than international. This international is something that's really very relatively small, like 1%. Most of what happens in the world is always local. Nevertheless, you can't deny the fact that today the sense of global reality is unique. I think very few places you could go that people have not got a sense of global presence. So our imagination, or the field of our imagination is, I'm always careful when I say things like expanded, but encompasses, maybe that's a better word, encompasses notion of the world as a finite but complex, various reality. We all acknowledge the fact that local is complex and unique, while it has transpersonal characteristics that you can, from one group to another, there are some similarities and structural similarities in terms of social organizations, thinking, etc., etc. But there is a zeitgeist today, to me, undeniable, that has that larger sense, even in the sense that our desire to accept people as equals from everywhere else. And I know we're on the verge of it, and I think young people are more take that more for granted than my generation, and hopefully in the future that will just continue to expand. But so to me, there is a zeitgeist that is different from the years of the First World War or previous to that. There is a greater sense of shared realities.
When you see that sense of globality or totality resonating in so much of the new work that we're seeing, which seems to have taken on an almost rigorous attention to materiality.
Well, how do you manifest that sense? As I was saying in my painting, at some point I made that decision to take the material and just put it into that place as a way of locating that event. So I can understand that with the kind of, that's kind of a cliche, but there's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of stuff that ultimately, in some sense, has really, its stuff can be totally meaningless. Like, how much stuff does anybody need? But as a material that is loaded culturally, instead of using paint, I could see why they use the material that already exists, because there's so much of it. You don't need to refine something to, to make the point of the material. So yeah, I could, actually it's really interesting you mention that. I think I have sort of started to accept that idea. I haven't really developed it because, I like to think about things for a while before I make any kind of pronouncements, which are always very short-lived anyways, but.
To what extent, in your own practice, because you're well-read, has theory played a role, if any?
In the 70s, I did a tabula rasa and I started from scratch. And at that point, I looked at all the work I had made, and there were all these very big gestural paintings. Actually, they're still big gestural paintings in very different ways, but I've made them my own. In any case, I said, well, what do all these paintings have in common? And when I was in France one winter, I drew little pictures. I didn't have slides or any kind of equipment with me from the studio. And I noticed that shape became had a presence in all the works that I was remembering and drawing. And I thought, yeah, what is shape? So this question of what is shape, really, what is shape? So then I became interested in the idea of constructing shape. No color though to start with, black and white, just black. And I wanted the shape not to have an identity with anything that I knew, like chair, table, house, car, whatever. So I made these shapes that had their own sort of unique identity. And then I ran my finger along each shape because I was wondering, how do I create an interior construction to this shape that had an integral relationship to its external parameter, because that's what gave the shape identity. But how can you make an internal configuration that has this integrity? So then I ran my fingers along the outside of the shape, and every time it changed direction, I called that significant points. And I connected them, and voila, there I had this internal configuration. And then I suddenly realized, wow, I can do this in many different ways. And I grew up with this idea of what I thought, at least, singular notions of truth. The truth lies here, and you have to look for the truth, and truth this, and truth that. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, this is as true as that is as true, that this is as true, and I could make a whole group of different internal configurations, all appropriately connected to its external parameter. And so this idea of multiple truth suddenly just came into view, and oh wow, that was amazing. Well, at this point, having gone to art school in Toronto, to OCA, we were marked A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. There was no real discussion about art history even, and what we were doing in relationship to that in our classrooms. There was no discussion. We were sort of, in a sense, almost autodidact, because we went to New York. We went into people's cars, we stayed in hotels, on floors and with mattresses on the floor and God knows what. And we were really eager to see contemporary art. And we read about it in magazines. So I really wasn't aware of the theoretical implications of French structuralist or post-structuralist thought. But when I did find out about it, I went, wow, that's what I was doing. So theory comes before or after, but it confirmed that somewhere along the line, my thinking was not so far off the inquiry that other people had at that same time. And I think the thing theory today is fascinating. It's not about the object and what the object, the sort of structuralist approach to the object, but the object as an agent. And when I'm talking about the materiality that young artists are using, well, those materials are basically an agent for a narrative that they're articulating. And it's just I find it fascinating. I love to read what other people think because it expands my own thinking, and sometimes if I'm lucky enough it confirms that I'm not so far off the mark.
Well, that brings us perhaps to an even larger group, the general public. I guess I'm curious to what extent you hope the public will come to the work, or how you expect them to come to the work.
Well,
or you to the public, for that matter.
Faith. I'm my first public. So I do the work for myself so that I can, articulate to myself something that I want to represent to myself. In other words, making art for me is representing back to myself how I think and what I'm thinking about. So it's a kind of record of that. But it's not just a record, but the adventure of actually doing it is that why would you do it if you already knew what you were going to do? So the whole point is you start somewhere and it takes you on some kind of an adventure and you don't know exactly where you're going to end up. And in the meantime, you're learning all this stuff and you're becoming more aware of certain things. So it's like a win-win. And I've forgotten your question. I'm getting carried away. That last part of the question.
How do you expect the public to come to the work?
Okay. So I do my best to try and incorporate in this work everything that I know about representation, and that I'm counting on the fact that somehow this will resonate with the viewer. In fact, I'm really counting on the fact that something about the work will resonate with the viewer, and they, as I learn to see myself, reflecting back to myself how I'm thinking, what I'm thinking about, and
Well, there are two members of the public that are of special interest to artists, of course. One is the role of the curator, and the other is the role of the critic. About the curator, do you have any thoughts about your own experience of how you've seen curating function, particularly today, of course?
Well, curating to me is, I think, the best curator. Harold Zeman is one of my heroes, and just because he had a conception, he had been struggling equally with this notion of presence, existence in the moment when he was curating. It wasn't just, he didn't just look to the artists, he himself was evolving his own way of thinking. And then talking with many artists, that his notion of the moment of what was that amazing exhibition again?
When attitudes
When
become form.
attitude become form, evolved. And to me, that's a curator that I want to be involved with.
The critic. Of course, when we assume a critic is going to be well versed in the work before they think about it and write about it. Do you have any thoughts about
Absolutely.
criticism?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really, really, really lucky to have had some really interesting people write about my work. James Campbell was one of those people. He himself was quite, he was philosophically quite well versed and interested. And he was really interested in the conversation. So when he wrote about the work, it was wonderful to see his take on it. And I think a writer it's really exciting when a writer has their own sort of, brings also their own perspective on the work. And that's why it's out there. It's not just about me. It's about the dialogue that you have with someone else, and a writer can do that. Andy Payne's done wonderful job as well. People like Yam have even written short texts, and yeah, I've been very lucky that what has been written generally, Sylvie Parent, people have really made an effort to try and bring their own perspective to bear on the work, but also not denying the work. But it's been an exchange, and I love that. Yeah, that's a privilege.
I know that very early on in your career, John Bentley Mays wrote a review of your work at the time. And of course, John went on to become the critic for the Globe and Mail, and became quite controversial in terms of how he looked at art. He had definitely, if we're talking about looking at art from a position, certainly John Bentley Mays did. What was your experience of that?
Oh, I was very young, and he wrote a very nice piece, quite a big piece for the Globe and Mail, but he made a few comments that I disagreed with, so I took him to task on it. Not a good idea, but and he certainly put me in my place. But I thought he was very good. I mean, I didn't agree with everything he said, but he certainly made a real serious effort. And I'm not. There have been some good writers, but we really need a bit more of that, like really fully engaged and expand the conversation. I'd love it if there were more. I'm sure there are people out there as we speak that I'm not aware of at the moment that are doing just that. So yeah.
Everybody knows that collectors are important to artists. Some even imagine that artists have collectors, which sometimes is true. Any thoughts about collectors?
I'm my best collector. I wish I knew some collectors. Yeah, that would be nice.
We were talking about critics a while ago, and I think you mentioned that artists write criticism as well as professional critics. Do you think that artists write differently than professional critics themselves? Is there something they bring to the equation that's different?
Of course. I mean, I've written on other artists' work. Besides having a conversation with the artist, you bring the experience of making. So when I look at a work, it doesn't have to be something I'm writing about. The curiosity I have is why did that artist make this decision? And, you know, so it's, you know, I know from, and which was my curiosity about looking at works historically also, is I know that artists don't make random gestures, even if you don't understand the gesture after the fact. Those gestures are all connected, those decisions all have come out of a conversation. So I'm always trying to interpret those kind of conversations that an artist is having through the work. And that's definitely how I write about work, how I've written about work, is through that kind of conversation with the work. And I think that if you've never actually made work, then you have a different kind of conversation. So I think artists write differently about work than someone who comes to it from a purely sort of theoretical, critical perspective.
Many people express the feeling that they would have become artists if only they could have understood how they could have supported themselves. And as a consequence, they didn't become artists. What does it take for an artist to actually persevere? What is it about the perseverance that an artist brings to their practice that succeeds?
First of all, you don't think that way. If you start thinking, how am I going to support myself as an artist? Forget it. You just have to do what you have to do, and you know, whatever it is that you have to do, you know that's not the main event. So it's not like you're committing your life to, you know, to doing this or that. I mean, obviously teaching, that's just a wonderful alternative because it feeds everything as well. But, you know, 1% projects that are not necessarily part of your own it's more like applied art, not necessarily part of your own discourse. They might have aspects of it, but they're not part of that main body of work. You know, so you do those. But I've had all kinds of jobs in the beginning, and none of them felt hopeless because I was just supporting the very thing I wanted to do. So, and being an artist is so rewarding, and you know, what a privilege to have discovered that possibility, to have the opportunity to really examine your own life, to examine it through the process of making, and to be, you know, it's an amazing adventure, and it's an amazing way of expanding your own sense of being in the world, your consciousness, your connectivity with other people, to, you know, you think about the whole thing. Like, what other place do you get, what other engagement do you get that kind of opportunity? And that is to say, I also want to say this, the fact that, you know, my work isn't everywhere and I don't have a lot of people supporting it, etc., etc. Really, you just need a few people. You need enough to keep your optimism going, and the rest just takes care of itself. And, you know, we haven't been at war so far. We haven't had these kind of disruptions that other people have had. You know, I've had, you know, I dare not to say it, you know, I'm doing okay. One of the things I'm interested in, have always been interested in, is the nature of cognition and perception. And of course, when something is new and fresh, you have to define it, you have to understand it, you have to get to know it. So it has this appeal of engaging us in a way that makes us rethink reality, it makes us redefine it. And of course, being an artist is very much about that continual process of reiterating in the moment the experience of being in the world. And of course, all these different new factors of, new sort of areas of epistemology play a role. But originality is always going to exist. Not because it's just the way of life having to constantly reinvent itself. There is no form of life that is static. So the nature of the beast, the nature of life is to constantly reinvent itself. So my idea of originality is a reinvention, but in many, many different forms. So I see it has to be always part of who we are. Authenticity, that's a different story. Authenticity is, in my understanding, I can work off somebody else's work and contribute very little to that conversation. That borders on the inauthentic to me. But I could work off somebody else's work and take an idea that already existed, take it apart and reconstitute it. And suddenly we see it in a new form. That's authentic. That's an authentic reality. When I make work, that's what I try to do. I try to bring everything that I know about the world and I'm learning about the world in it's not good or bad, or it's just the totality of that experience to bear on what I'm doing as I'm moving through the world and leaving these traces. And to me, I try to be as authentic as I can towards that. And that means acknowledging, my history, acknowledging every aspect. What we want to know about ourselves and what we don't want to know about ourselves all becomes part of the whole thing. So the authenticity is really, the struggle of being and becoming who you can be and who you are. So I think that's about as far as I can put the idea of authentic. And, it doesn't matter what you do for a living or how you live your life. Everyone has the opportunity of being authentic, and then some people really take great pride in not being authentic. So that's like the opposite. So are they authentic in that gesture? I don't know. I mean, we can play with it ad infinitum. But, yeah. In that real global reality that we live in, and not global, but the universe, and our little contributions, our minuscule, almost invisible realities, the authentic is what's important to make us real to ourselves. And that's probably the most important part.